Well, in a time when we've had lots of bad news lately, today is a time for good news. The good news that Jesus is alive. He is alive indeed. And as we look at his resurrection story, we're going to be beginning in the Gospel of Matthew, but we're going to look at the other four Gospels also. And we notice that there are some small differences in the accounts. So let's talk about why that is. First of all, there are four different writers of the four different Gospels. So there are four different sources. If there was to be an accident of some kind and there were four different eyewitnesses and you were to interview those four different eyewitnesses, each one of them would have seen things a little bit differently because of their personality, because of their point of view. So in the Gospels, let's take a look at the four writers, a brief look. The first gospel in our Bible is Matthew. Matthew was also called Levi. He was a disciple of Jesus, but before Jesus called him to be a disciple, he was a tax collector. So that leads us to believe that Matthew was a bottom line kind of guy. He was an accountant. He was all about nickels and noses. You'll notice in his account of Jesus's life, he begins with a genealogy of Jesus. He is the most Jewish of the gospel writers in his writing. He quotes the Old Testament prophecies the most number of times, time and time again. He'll say, this happened to fulfill this prophecy. This happened to fulfill this prophecy. He does it all the way through his book and his writings. So Matthew was writing mostly to Jewish believers. The Gospel of Mark, although being the second in line in our Bible, was probably the first one written chronologically. We know that John Mark, as a young man, had gone on the first missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas, but somewhere along the way, not too far into the journey, John Mark bailed. He left. It caused quite a split between Paul and Barnabas, so much so that when they went to go on the second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to take John Mark and Paul said no, so they split. They went separate ways. So Paul on his second journey took Silas and Barnabas took John Mark and they went to Cyprus. We know that John Mark was a young man that was well educated, probably well off. He became a scribe to Simon Peter. So we notice that his gospel very much has the personality of Simon Peter. It's very fast moving. It's very action packed. It's not necessarily chronological. It's kind of like we think of Simon Peter, who was one who would think or speak, act or speak before he even thought. This is the type of personality that the Gospel of Mark has. Very, very fast moving and focused more on the actions of Jesus than the words of Jesus, although it does record both. In the Gospel of Luke, we know that Luke was the only Gospel writer who was a Gentile. He was not a Jew. He met Paul on one of Paul's missionary journeys. He was a doctor. He began to travel with Paul. He traveled extensively with Paul, probably the rest of Paul's life. He probably was Paul's personal doctor. And Luke says in his writing that he was addressing his letter or gospel to Theophilus. And he says, Theophilus, I wanted to give you the most accurate account, which sounds very much like a doctor. Want to be very detail-oriented, want to be very accurate. And so since Luke was not among the eyewitnesses, he talked to many eyewitnesses of Jesus's birth, life, and death, and resurrection. Luke also includes the genealogy of Jesus, and Luke records most of the details that we know about the birth of Jesus, which would be very much like a doctor to do. And then we have the gospel writer John. John referred to himself over and over again as the disciple Jesus loved, and not saying that God loved him more than others, or that wasn't a sign of spiritual pride. I think that was really a sign that John just was amazed that Jesus loved him. He and his brother James were the sons of Zebedee. Jesus renamed them or nicknamed them the sons of thunder. They were rough men, they were blue collar men, they were fishermen, and yet he just couldn't get over the fact that Jesus loved him so much and called him not only to be one of the 12 disciples, but to be one of the inner circle, the inner three. And that was James, John, and Peter, who were the ones who got to see things and do things like the Transfiguration that no other disciple got to see or do. So these are the 4 different men that wrote these Gospels. These are the 4 different sources, 4 different personalities, 4 different points of view. I remember a few years back, I went with my sister and my niece. We were in Paris for a few days. We went to the Notre Dame Cathedral, obviously before it was burned. And when we got in that evening and we were talking about our things of the day and what we had observed and what had gone through our mind, it was so interesting because my niece is an artist and she does design type things, and so the thing that she noticed the most as we were looking around the cathedral were the artwork, the beautiful paintings and the statues and the tapestries. And my sister is a Christian writer and apologist, and the thing that she noticed the most were the prayer altars where you pay money and you light candles and you do all these things that really, we don't think are absolutely necessary because we have a high priest in Jesus to go to God for us, and I'm a contractor. So I'm standing in the middle of Notre Dame and I'm looking up at the ceiling and I'm thinking, how did they build this humongous building so many hundreds of years ago without the aid of modern equipment? It's just boggled my mind. So all 3 of us were standing in the same place at the same time, and all 3 of us are thinking totally different things. So again, as we move into it, we will see a few small discrepancies. They're small, but we do want to make note of those things. So as we begin, let's say we're going to be reporters, and so let's look at when did this happen. I'm reading out of Matthew 28, verse 1 says, "Early on Sunday morning, just as the new day was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went out to visit the tomb." Okay, so all of the writers agree with this. Matthew and Luke say early. Luke says very early on Sunday morning. Mark says just at sunrise. John says while it was still dark. So we know that it was early in the morning on Sunday morning. The sun is just beginning to come up over the horizon. And so who is there? Well, according to Matthew 28:1, Matthew mentions Mary Magdalene, and he says the other Mary. So in Mark, we find that it also lists Mary Magdalene, and it identifies the other Mary. It says Mary, the mother of James. Well, this James, because there were 2 disciples of Jesus that were named James. There was James and John, who were brothers, sons of Zebedee, and then there was James, which they call James the Less. Now, I don't know if that means he was younger or if he was smaller, but to distinguish James, son of Zebedee, from the other James, they would call the other James James the Less. So this is Mary, mother of James the Less. And then Mark also tells us that Salome was there. Well, Salome is the mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee. So she was the wife of Zebedee and the mother of James and John. So there are 2 mothers of disciples here, along with Mary Magdalene. In Luke, it says the women, and then it also, in addition to the ones we talked about, names Joanna. Joanna was the wife of Chusa, who was a steward of Herod. So she actually lived in the household of Herod, but she had been healed by Jesus, and she was a follower of Jesus. And then John only mentions Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene was from the village of Magdala. Magdalene wasn't her last name, it wasn't her profession, it was her town. Like we say Joseph of Arimathea or Jesus of Nazareth. It was the town that she came from. It was a fishing village on the Sea of Galilee. We know that Mary was healed by Jesus of 7 demons. Historically, they've said that she was a prostitute, but that's not really biblical. We don't really know that for sure. We do know that she had 7 demons, and that Jesus healed her of the 7 demons. She was a supporter of Jesus. All of these women were supporters of Jesus. They traveled with Jesus. They ministered to Jesus, it says, as during his earthly ministry. So, what do we see about the early visitors to the tomb? Well, we see several things. The obvious thing, the most obvious thing, first of all, is that they were all women. It even tells us, let's see, which one tells us this? Mark tells us, gives us the detail that on Saturday evening after the sun went down, which was the end of the Sabbath, that Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went to purchase burial spices. So we know that these women followed Jesus in life and went with him, supported him, probably took care of the needs of Jesus and his disciples. We know that these women were at the foot of the cross. They were there through the whole suffering. They even stayed after Jesus died. Now, how do we know they stayed after Jesus died? Because the Bible tells us that when Jesus died, that the body had to be taken down before sunset. The Sabbath started at sunset on Friday and lasted till sunset on Saturday. And Joseph of Arimathea very bravely went to Pilate and asked if he could take the body of Jesus, if he could have the body of Jesus. And so Joseph of Arimathea and probably Nicodemus went with him, went and took down the body, wrapped it, and took it to the tomb. And the Bible tells us that these women followed them to the tomb. So even after Jesus died, they stayed there. They followed the body of Jesus to the tomb. They went to their homes to observe the Sabbath that evening, and as soon as they could, on Saturday night, after the Sabbath was over, they went to buy burial spices. And then they were up before the sunrise, because even as the sun was rising, they were arriving at the tomb. These were women of courage. They were women of conviction. They were women of compassion. They wanted to minister to the body of Jesus even after his death. They wanted him to have a proper Jewish burial. These were amazing women. So now let's see what happened. So in verses 2 through 10, it says, "Suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, rolled aside the stone, and sat on it. His face shone like lightning, his clothing was as white as snow. The guards shook with fear when they saw him, and they fell into a dead faint." I love the picture here. I love seeing the angel rolling that stone away and sitting up on top of it, and the guards just falling out all over the place. It doesn't mention that the women were here when this happened, and it even leads us to believe in other scriptures that they didn't actually witness this part of it, because we know that they were discussing on their way to the tomb, how in the world are we going to get the stone away? It's so heavy. And it says when they got to the tomb, the stone was moved. But I do love this part. It's so It's so great to think about how God just moved in such a wonderful, dramatic way. And we will be looking at the angels and their conversation with the women in our next video.